There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come with sirens or warnings or a chance to prepare. It arrives quietly, in a familiar laugh, in a voice you've known for years, in a moment so ordinary that your mind almost refuses to believe what your eyes are seeing. And in that one frozen second, everything you thought was real dissolves, not slowly, all at once, like a photograph dropped into fire. That is exactly the kind of pain that found Suzie Calloway on what should have been the most unremarkable Tuesday of her life. But here is the thing about pain that arrives without warning. Sometimes, buried deep beneath the devastation, beneath the tears and the silence and the shattered pieces of a life you carefully built, something new is already beginning to grow. This is not just a story about betrayal. This is a story about what happens after. This is the story of a woman who lost everything in one night and used every single piece of it to build something the world had never seen before.
Hi, I'm Ray. Welcome to my channel, Tales of the Heart by Ray. I am glad to have you as part of my community. Please comment where you are watching from. I would like to know. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more beautiful and interesting stories.
To understand what Suzie lost, you first have to understand what she had. Or at least, what she believed she had. Because the most dangerous illusions are never the obvious ones. They are the ones that look exactly like love. Suzie Calloway was 32 years old, and by every visible measurement, her life looked complete. She had a home, a warm, carefully decorated house on Birchwood Lane, with cream-colored curtains she had chosen herself, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of the cinnamon candles she burned on Sunday mornings. She had a career she was quietly proud of, a small circle of people she trusted with her whole heart, and a husband she had chosen above every other option the world had ever placed in front of her. His name was Nathan Calloway, and for 7 years she had believed, with every fiber of her being, that choosing him was the best decision she had ever made. Nathan was the kind of man who knew how to present himself to the world. Tall, confident, socially gifted in that effortless way that made everyone in a room lean slightly toward him when he spoke. He told good stories. He laughed at the right moments. He had a way of making people feel chosen, like being in his company was a privilege, not an accident. And for years, Suzie had felt that way too. She had felt like the luckiest woman alive. That feeling, she would later realize, was the most expensive thing she ever paid for. Because while Suzie was busy believing in their life together, planning their future, defending his character to anyone who dared to question it, rearranging her own ambitions to fit more neatly around his, Nathan had been slowly, quietly, methodically dismantling everything she trusted. Not in dramatic, obvious ways, in small ones. A late night here, an unexplained distance there. A coldness in his eyes that she kept explaining away because love, real devoted love, always searches for the most generous interpretation. And Suzie was generous, almost dangerously so. It was one of the things people loved most about her. It was also the thing that made her most vulnerable. And then there was Lila. If Nathan was the wound, Lila Chen was the salt poured directly into it. Lila had been Suzie's best friend since they were 22 years old, fresh out of college, both terrified and excited about the world in equal measure. They had built their friendship the way you build the most important things in life. Slowly, honestly, through shared vulnerability. Lila had been there when Suzie's father passed away. She had sat on Suzie's bathroom floor at 2 a.m, holding her hand while she sobbed. She had stood beside her on her wedding day in a soft blue dress, tears in her eyes, squeezing Suzie's fingers and whispering, "You deserve all of this. 10 years of friendship. 10 years of trust. 10 years of Suzie believing that no matter what the world threw at her, Lila would always be on her side. You must understand this, not because it makes the betrayal more dramatic, but because it makes it more human. Because every single person listening to this right now has loved someone the way Suzie loved Lila, has trusted someone the way Suzie trusted Nathan, has built a life the way Suzie built hers, brick by careful brick, in good faith, with an open heart. And that is exactly why this story matters. Not because it is extraordinary, but because it is painfully, brutally ordinary. Betrayal doesn't only happen to naive people or weak people or foolish people. It happens to the best of us, the most loving of us, the most devoted of us. And when it comes, it doesn't knock. It walks right through the front door. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, when Suzie came home early from work. Nothing dramatic had led her there. A meeting had been canceled, the traffic had been lighter than usual, and she had been mildly looking forward to a quiet evening at home. She remembers the particular quality of the air that day, warm for October, heavy and still, the kind of evening that felt like it was holding its breath. She had her keys in her hand. She was thinking about what to make for dinner. Her mind was completely, peacefully ordinary. And then she heard the laughter. It drifted through the slightly open window of her own living room. Warm and intimate and unmistakably feminine. And with it, Nathan's voice, low and pleased in a way she hadn't heard in months. At first, her mind offered her every possible innocent explanation, because that is what minds do when they are not ready for the truth. Maybe it was the television. Maybe a colleague had stopped by. Maybe she was misreading the sound entirely. But as she moved closer, stepping quietly along the side of the house, toward that open window, her body already knew what her mind was still desperately trying to reject. She could feel it in the way her steps slowed, in the way her breathing became shallow, in the way her hand, still gripping her keys, began to tremble. She looked through the window, and the world she had spent 7 years building simply stopped existing. There was Nathan, her husband, her partner, the man she had stood beside at an altar and promised forever to. Leaning back in the armchair with the ease of someone completely at home in his own deception, and on his lap, laughing softly, running her fingers along the collar of his shirt, was Lila, her best friend, the woman who had cried at her wedding, the woman she had called at 3 a.m. during the hardest moments of her life. There they were, together, in the home that Suzie had poured herself into, in the marriage she had sacrificed for, in the life she had believed in so completely that the idea of it being false had never once crossed her mind as a real possibility. She could have walked away at that moment. She could have turned around, gotten back in her car, driven somewhere quiet, and decided what to do from a safe distance. Many people would have. But Suzie stood there, frozen at that window, just long enough to hear Nathan say the words that would echo inside her for the rest of her life. He leaned toward Lila, close and casual, and he said, as naturally as someone might comment on the weather, "I should have married you instead." And Lila laughed, softly, warmly, like it was a lovely thing to hear. Like it was not a sentence being carved directly into the heart of the woman standing 10 feet away. Something inside Suzie shattered. Not broke. That word is too gentle. It shattered. The way glass shatters when it falls from a great height, into too many pieces to count. Too small to pick up without cutting yourself. She pushed the front door open. The creak of it silenced the room instantly. Nathan stood, irritation crossing his face before he recognized her. And even then, even in the first unguarded second of being caught, his expression was not guilt. It was annoyance. The face of a man who had been interrupted, And Lila who had cried at the wedding, Lila who had held her hand on the bathroom floor, simply looked at her and smiled. A slow, unbothered smile. "Oh," she said, "you're back early. You're back early, not sorry, not ashamed, not even startled. Just the mild inconvenience of someone whose schedule had been disrupted." In that moment, Suzie understood something that no words could fully capture. She had not just been betrayed. She had been completely, deliberately, systematically erased. She had been replaced so thoroughly, so calmly, that her presence in her own home had become an inconvenience. And the most devastating part of all, they didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. What happened next was not something Suzie planned. When Lila stood up, adjusted her dress, and told her not to be dramatic, told her that she had always been too emotional, something ancient and primal rose up inside Suzie Calloway, and the palm of her hand connected with Lila's cheek before her mind had fully registered the decision. The sound of it echoed through the room like a period at the end of a very long sentence. And Nathan grabbed her wrist, hard, the way you grab someone you don't respect, the way you handle something that is inconveniencing you. Suzie pulled her arm back, and she looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years, and she said, quietly, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "No, I just finally found it." When they asked her to explain, she didn't. She simply looked between the two of them, memorizing their faces one final time, and she said, "You both deserve each other." Then she turned and walked out of her own house into the afternoon sun. What people don't tell you about the moment after devastation is that your body keeps moving even when your soul has gone completely still. Suzie's feet carried her down the street automatically, like muscle memory of being a person. But inside, she was somewhere entirely unreachable. The hot afternoon sun pressed down on her shoulders, and she felt none of it. The sounds of the neighborhood, a dog barking, a child somewhere laughing, the distant hum of a lawnmower, all of it reached her ears as if from underwater. Muffled, distant, part of a world she no longer belonged to. She walked without direction, without destination, without the small internal compass that usually guides us through our days. The little voice that says, "Go home now," or "Call someone," or "Sit down and breathe." That voice was gone. In its place was only a white, blank, roaring silence. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful at all, but is instead the loudest thing you have ever heard. She didn't wipe the tears that came. She didn't blow her phone notifications away. She didn't formulate a plan. She simply walked. One foot in front of the other, a woman with nowhere to go and nothing left to protect. Minutes passed. Then more. The sky had shifted from gold to deep amber. When Suzie realized she had walked much further than she intended. She was on the main road now, the wide, busy stretch of Carver Boulevard, where street lights were just beginning to flicker on, and the evening. Traffic moved with that particular urgency of people who had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them, a home worth returning to. Suzie had none of those things. Not anymore. And somewhere in the fog of grief and shock and absolute disorientation, she stepped off the curb. She didn't see the headlights until they were blinding her. She heard the horn, one sharp, desperate blast. She heard the screech of tires against asphalt, a sound so violent and final that it seemed to rearrange the molecules of the air. And then her body was lifted off the ground in a way that gravity had no polite language for, and the world spun in a complete and total revolution. And there was pain, sudden, white-hot, all-consuming, and then there was nothing, absolutely nothing. The specific nothing of unconsciousness, which is not peaceful or dreamlike the way movies suggest, but is instead simply an absence, a gap in the story. A sentence with no ending. Voices came first. Fragments, panicked, urgent, overlapping. Is she breathing? Someone call an ambulance. Don't move her. The words floated past her like debris in a current, present but unreachable. Her name, spoken by someone she didn't know, as if her identity could somehow pull her back to the surface. And somewhere, deep in the unreachable center of her, a voice, not anyone else's, but her own, said something that surprised even the unconscious version of herself. This is not the end. Small, stubborn, inexplicably certain. This is not the end. Suzie woke to the sound of machines. The steady, democratic beeping of a heart monitor, a sound that is both deeply clinical and somehow deeply reassuring, because it means the heart is still going, still arguing for its own continuation, still making its case for another day. The ceiling above her was white. The light was the particular fluorescent brightness of hospital rooms. Not warm, not natural, but functional. She was alive. That fact arrived in her consciousness not with relief, exactly, but with a kind of quiet surprise, as if being alive was an outcome she hadn't fully planned for. The nurse who noticed her open eyes was kind and efficient, the way good nurses always are. Warm without being sentimental, informative without being cold. She explained the injuries, minor fractures in her left wrist, deep bruising along her left side, a concussion that was being monitored carefully. Nothing permanent, the nurse said, nothing that wouldn't heal. And she used that word again, lucky. Suzie lay there, staring at the ceiling, and turned that word over in her mind, the way you'd turn over a stone to see what's underneath it. Lucky. Maybe. Or maybe luck was the wrong category entirely. Maybe what had happened to her wasn't about luck at all. She asked who had brought her in. The nurse paused, as if deciding how to answer that question, then said simply, a man. A man who had refused to leave until the doctors confirmed she was stable. A man who had sat in the waiting room alone, still in his suit, for 4 hours, asking for updates on a stranger. Suzie absorbed this information carefully. A stranger had cared more about her survival than the two people who had known her for a decade. The universe, she was beginning to understand, had a very particular sense of irony. When the door to her room opened and Adrian Black walked in, Suzie's first impression was of presence. Pure, undiluted presence. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark suit that looked like it had been made specifically for him by someone who understood that clothing was a language. His face was sharp, not unkind, but precise, the kind of face that misses nothing and conceals everything. He moved through the room the way people move when they have spent decades knowing exactly who they are, with a quietness that is somehow louder than noise. He looked at her with dark, steady eyes that carried the particular weight of someone who had seen a great deal of the world and had made his peace with most of it. "My name is Adrian Black," he said, "and then you saved my life." Suzie stared at him. "I don't even know you." And Adrian Black said something that she would think about for weeks afterward. He said, "That's the interesting part." It took the next several minutes of conversation for Suzie to understand the full geometry of what had happened on Carver Boulevard. Adrian Black had been in the car. His car, a dark, expensive, late-model vehicle, had been the one whose headlights had blinded her. He had been the one driving. He had been the one who hit her. And he had been the one who stayed, who called the ambulance himself, who rode with her to the hospital, who sat in that waiting room for 4 hours in his pressed black suit, asking nurses for updates on a woman whose name he didn't yet know. She stared at him for a long moment after he explained this, trying to locate the appropriate emotion. He didn't apologize. He offered no elaboration, no excessive explanation, no performance of guilt. He simply stated the facts. He had hit her, and he had stayed. Both were equally true. "Why stay?" she asked. Most people would have called an ambulance and left, and Adrian looked at her with those unreadable eyes. And he said something that landed with much more force than she expected, "Because you didn't look like someone who wanted to live." The room went very quiet, because he was right. And she knew it. And the fact that a complete stranger could see that truth when she herself had not fully acknowledged it, had been too deep inside the fog of grief to name what she had felt standing on that curb, was both frightening and strangely, unexpectedly freeing, like being seen, fully, by someone with no reason to lie to her. The quiet of the hospital room lasted only until Nathan arrived. He came quickly, or quickly enough, to suggest that his motivation was something other than genuine love and panic. He walked in wearing concern, like an outfit he had chosen carefully for the occasion, and he reached for her hand with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 7 years performing the role of devoted husband. Suzie pulled her hand away, not dramatically, not with a speech, simply and completely, the way you close a door you have decided to keep closed. Nathan's expression flickered. That microsecond of irritation before the concern mask reassembled itself. She saw it. She had been watching his face for 7 years. She saw everything. The conversation that followed was painful. Not because it was loud, but because it was so transparent. Nathan said the things men say in these moments, things that are designed to sound like honesty, while being constructed entirely from evasion. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said it was a mistake. And when Suzie asked him, quietly and steadily, how long had this been happening, he hesitated. That hesitation, that single moment of calculation before the answer. "A few months," he finally said. "A few months." While she was defending him at dinner parties, while she was planning their future, while she was loving him faithfully, completely, without question. A few months. "Get out," she said. Nathan told her she didn't mean it. He told her she was just upset. He told her she was his wife, as if the legal category was sufficient reason to stay in a burning building. And Suzie looked at him. At this man she had chosen above everything else. This man she had given 7 years and her complete heart and her absolute trust. And she said the 6 words that ended a chapter of her life permanently. "Not anymore," she said. "Not anymore." Adrian watched all of this without speaking. He didn't intervene, didn't defend her, didn't insert himself into her moment. He simply stood there, present, calm, completely still. And that stillness was somehow its own form of support. When Nathan finally turned and demanded to know who he was, Adrian answered with the only sentence that mattered. "Someone who doesn't lie to her." 4 words. They landed like a verdict. Nathan left. The door closed, and the air in the room became, in a way that was almost physical, cleaner. Alone again after Adrian left his card and departed, Suzie lay in the hospital bed with the city darkening outside her window, and a small rectangle of white cardstock in her hand that felt, irrationally, like the most significant object she had ever held. She turned it over. Adrian Black. A phone number. Nothing else. No title. No company name. No elaborate sales pitch. Just a name and a way to reach it. She thought about her options. And as she laid them out in her mind, one by one, like cards on a table, she understood for the first time just how thin the life she had built actually was. She could go back to Birchwood Lane, to the cream curtains and the cinnamon candles and the life that now felt like a stage set with all the actors gone. She could call her mother, accept the sympathy and the casseroles and the well-meaning advice from people who had never had to start over from nothing. She could find an apartment, get a lawyer, file the papers, begin the slow, grinding, dignified process of legal separation and financial settlement and the reconstruction of a life from its rubble. All of these were real options. All of them were survivable. But survivable and living are very different things. And somewhere in the long hours of that hospital night, Suzie Calloway decided that she was done with merely surviving. She had spent 7 years being a good wife. She had spent 10 years being a devoted friend. She had given and given and given. Her time, her energy, her trust, her love. And she had received betrayal in return. She was done being generous with people who would take her generosity and use it as a weapon. She was done being soft in a world that had shown her exactly what it did to soft things. She dialed the number. Adrian answered on the second ring. Adrian Black. His voice was exactly as she remembered, calm and direct, with the particular quality of someone who is never caught off guard, even when they should be. She told him who she was, though somehow she suspected he already knew. She said she wanted to hear the proposal. He said he would be there in 10 minutes. He arrived in 9. This time he was not alone. A sleek, professional woman accompanied him, carrying a tablet and radiating the specific energy of someone who executes plans for a living and has no patience for inefficiency. Adrian placed a folder on the table beside Suzie's bed. Black, slim, bearing no identifying marks. He opened it, and inside were documents, contracts, organizational charts. Dense pages of information that Suzie couldn't yet decode but could recognize as important. The vocabulary of power. Adrian explained himself in the way powerful people explain themselves, not with apology or preamble, but with precision. He ran a company, several in fact, global in reach, diversified in industry, technology, infrastructure, investment, and sectors Suzie didn't have names for yet. He had been building something for years, he said, with the careful patience of someone who understood that the most important structures are the ones that take the longest to build. And he needed something that he had found over years of searching among the qualified and the ambitious and the credentialed. Almost and impossible to find reliably in anyone. He needed loyalty, real loyalty, not the professional performance of loyalty, but the genuine article. The kind that comes from someone who understands what betrayal costs, who has felt its weight personally, who would recognize it approaching from 1,000 miles away, and never, under any circumstances, deliver it to someone who trusted them. He needed someone like Suzie. She pushed back, as she should have. She told him he didn't know her. He said he knew enough. She asked what she would receive in return. And Adrian Black looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and offered her something that no amount of money could have made more powerful. He offered her transformation. Not a salary. Not a title. Transformation. She would work directly with him. She would learn business, strategy, negotiation, the architecture of real power in the real world. She would be trained, educated, exposed to rooms she had never been allowed into, conversations she had never been permitted to hear, and in the process, he said, she would become something that no one could ever take from her again. Untouchable. That word. Suzie had spent 7 years being touchable, available, open, accessible to anyone who wanted to reach in and rearrange her heart. The idea of untouchable felt like being offered oxygen in a room that had been slowly running out of it. But she wasn't naive. She had been naive once. She pressed him. What was the catch? What did he actually want from her? And Adrian told her plainly she would need to release her old life. Not just legally, not just geographically, but entirely. No going back, no second chances, distributed to people who had already shown her exactly who they were. No carrying the past forward like a stone tied around her neck. The old Suzie, the trusting, giving, endlessly patient woman who had loved people all the way to her own destruction, had to be laid down. Permanently. And what would he get? She asked him this directly, because she had stopped being the kind of person who didn't ask. He told her, a loyal ally. Someone without illusions. Someone who had been tested by fire and had come out the other side with her integrity intact and her softness burned away. Someone dangerous in the best possible meaning of the word. The room was very quiet for a long moment. Then Suzie reached for the pen. Her hand was trembling slightly, in the way that hands tremble, not from fear, but from the particular bodily recognition of a pivotal moment. Adrian said nothing. He didn't encourage her or pressure her or perform patience for her benefit. He simply stood there, present and still, and let her make her own choice. Because that was the first thing he was offering her that Nathan never had. A real choice. No manipulation, no performance, no illusion. Just a decision, and all the consequences of it laid honestly before her. She signed her name, and something happened in that moment that she would struggle to describe for years afterward. It wasn't dramatic. There was no rushing wind, no sudden clarity, no cinematic swell of music. It was quieter than that, deeper, like a door closing very softly, but very permanently somewhere inside her. The woman who had stood at a window on Birchwood Lane and watched her world disintegrate, who had walked into traffic in a fog of grief, who had lain in a hospital bed wondering if surviving was worth the effort. That woman was stepping back, and someone else, someone still unnamed, still unformed, still raw at the edges, was stepping forward. "Welcome," Adrian said, "to your new life." Suzie looked at him. She looked at her signature. She looked back at him. And when she asked what happened next, the answer was exactly what she both feared and needed in equal measure. "Now," Adrian said, "we begin." What followed was not what anyone looking at Suzie Calloway in that hospital bed would have predicted. The world expected her to grieve, to spiral, to spend months alternating between rage and depression in the predictable cycle of someone who had suffered a devastating personal loss. Her mother expected to receive tearful phone calls. Her colleagues expected distracted, diminished performance. Nathan, and this is the part that matters most, expected her to come back. He was the kind of man who had always relied on other people's need for him. He expected Suzie to remember all the good years, to weigh them against the betrayal, and decide the scale still tipped in his favor. He expected her to choose the familiar pain over the unknown freedom. He had done the math, and it made sense to him. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Suzie was discharged from the hospital on a Thursday morning with a prescription, a follow-up appointment, and a number already saved in her phone. She did not return to Birchwood Lane. She instructed her lawyer, a woman she found through one of the ressorts Adrian's assistant had quietly arranged for her before she even left the Bangor hospital, to begin the separation proceedings. She collected the items that mattered to her in 2 carefully managed visits to the house, accompanied each time by someone from that same quiet network of Adrian's people who had materialized around her with such efficiency that she had stopped being surprised by it. The cinnamon candles she left behind. The cream curtains, too. Let Nathan keep the aesthetic of a life he'd hollowed out. She wanted none of it. She moved into a furnished apartment in a quieter part of the city. Clean lines, good light, completely empty of history. She slept on the first night better than she had slept in 2 years, which told her something important about what her body had been carrying without her permission. The work began on a Monday. Adrian Black's office was on the 43rd floor of a building made almost entirely of glass. The kind of building that had been designed to make you feel the altitude. The view stretched across the city, like a map of everything that was possible, and Suzie stood at the window on her first morning and looked out at it and felt something she had forgotten she was capable of feeling. Hunger, not the desperate clinging hunger of someone who is afraid of losing what they have, but the clean, forward-facing hunger of someone who is just beginning to understand what they might be able to reach. Adrian was a precise and unsparing teacher. He did not coddle. He did not offer praise for ordinary competence. He expected her to show up fully prepared, to ask excellent questions, and to fail fast enough to learn quickly. In the first 2 weeks, she sat in on every meeting she was permitted to attend, said nothing, and absorbed everything. She learned the specific language of boardrooms, not just the vocabulary, but the silences, the pauses, the way real decisions were communicated in a glance across a table, rather than in anything that was officially spoken. She learned who had power and who only appeared to. She learned the difference, and it was not always the difference you'd expect. She read every night in the quiet apartment with the good light. She read business strategy, organizational psychology, economic history, the biographies of people who had built things that lasted. She read the way people read when they are doing it for survival rather than pleasure. Focused, systematic, remembering everything. Her mind, which had spent years being occupied with the work of maintaining a life that was quietly falling apart around her, turned out to be hungry for exactly this. Sharp, organized, capable of the kind of disciplined analysis that Adrian placed in front of her and expected immediately. Within a month, she stopped sitting silently in meetings. She began to contribute. Carefully, at first, a question here, a quietly offered observation there. But Adrian noticed. He always noticed. He would acknowledge it afterward, briefly, the way he acknowledged everything. Not with excessive praise, but with the specific, targeted recognition of someone who understood that what you measured was what you managed. That question changed the direction of the room. He told her once, after a meeting in which she had asked something that reframed an entire discussion. She filed that away. She used it again. While Suzie was rebuilding herself on the 43rd floor, Nathan Calloway was doing what men like Nathan always do when the thing they took for granted reveals itself to be more valuable than they understood. He was regretting. It began slowly. The separation papers arrived, and he stared at them for longer than he would ever admit. That carefully constructed confidence of his developing its first real cracks. He had expected the phone calls, the tearful negotiations, the wavering, the door left open the way Suzie had always left doors open for the people she loved. Instead, there was silence, clean and total. Her lawyer contacted his lawyer. Suzie contacted no one. She did not appear at his door with red eyes and a changed mind. She did not send messages through mutual friends asking how he was. She simply disappeared into her own life without him in it. And Nathan, who had always measured his own value through the mirror of other people's need for him, found the silence profoundly disorienting. Lila, it turned out, was a far less comfortable choice in practice than she had been in theory. The fantasy of someone is always more appealing than the reality, and Nathan, who had told a woman he was in love with her husband's wife that he should have married her instead, discovered fairly quickly that what he had actually wanted was not Lila specifically, but the novelty of something he wasn't supposed to have. Once he had it, the shine was unremarkable. Lila was careless with money, territorial in ways that felt confining rather than romantic, and entirely uninterested in the domestic rhythms that Nathan had quietly relied on Suzie to maintain for 7 years. He cooked his own meals now. He managed his own calendar. He came home to a house with no candles, no careful arrangements, no one who had thought about his day before he arrived in it. The house on Birchwood Lane, which had always felt like a refuge, now felt like a very expensive container for his own bad choices. He began making inquiries, casual ones at first, asking their few remaining mutual acquaintances if they'd heard from Suzie how she was doing, whether she seemed okay. The answers he received were uniformly unhelpful, not because people didn't know, but because they did know. And what they knew was that Suzie Calloway was doing something that people who had predicted her collapse found deeply inconvenient to report. She was doing better than fine. She was, by all visible evidence, thriving. He heard the name Adrian Black for the first time over dinner with a colleague who worked in the financial sector who mentioned it casually. The way people mention large things when they assume you already know about them. Black Industries is making moves, the colleague said. Their new personal advisor is apparently extraordinary, someone named Calloway. Nathan set down his fork. His colleague kept talking. Nathan stopped listening. Calloway. He had not expected that name in that sentence in that world. He had not, if he was being honest with himself, expected Suzie Calloway to appear in any sentence that required the word extraordinary. That was his failure of imagination, and it cost him. Here is where the story changes in a way that Suzie herself did not see coming. Here is where the universe, which had arranged its pieces with more patience and precision than anyone involved had been able to perceive, showed its hand. 4 months into her work with Adrian, Suzie was assigned to lead the due diligence process on a major acquisition. A mid-sized technology company, solid product, underperforming management, significant untapped potential. She threw herself into it with the full force of everything she had become. She was methodical, precise, relentless. She didn't sleep particularly well during those 3 weeks, but she didn't resent it. She was building something, and the building felt more real and more hers than anything she had felt in years. During the review process, something caught her attention. A series of financial discrepancies, subtle, expertly constructed, designed to be overlooked by someone doing a routine review. But Suzie was not doing a routine review. She was doing the kind of review that only someone with no personal stake in the comfort of the outcome performs. She pulled the thread. She followed it through 3 layers of holding companies and 2 sets of offshore accounts, and one very carefully constructed legal entity designed specifically to obscure what it was actually doing. And at the end of that thread, she found a name that was connected to Nathan's business partner. And through that connection, a financial arrangement that implicated, indirectly but unmistakably, Nathan himself. She sat with that information for an entire night. She could have handed it to Adrian's legal team without saying a word. That would have been the professional choice. The information was relevant to the acquisition. It was precisely the kind of thing she had been hired to find. Her job was not complicated. She could have been clean and efficient and moved on. But Suzie Calloway had spent 7 years in a marriage that was a performance built on a foundation of concealed truths. She understood at a cellular level what it cost to build on a compromised foundation. She didn't want to simply report the discrepancy. She wanted to understand it, fully. Because she had learned something important in her months at Adrian Black's side. Information was power only when it was complete. Partial information was just a different kind of blindness, so she kept pulling the thread. What she found over the next 2 weeks was this: Nathan's apparent success. The business that he had always presented as the product of his own talent and initiative, the career he had used as a cornerstone of his identity and as a quiet way of diminishing Suzie's contributions to their household, was substantially built on a series of financial arrangements that did not withstand scrutiny. The confident man with the easy laugh and the perfectly told stories had been, for at least 4 years, operating in a gray area that was drifting steadily toward black. And the network that sustained this arrangement was the same network connected to the company Adrian was now considering acquiring. Suzie compiled everything, every document, every trail, every connection. She organized it with the precision and clarity of someone who had learned, at considerable personal cost, that ambiguity was the enemy of justice. Then she walked into Adrian's office and placed the folder on his desk and said nothing. She let the work speak. Adrian read it in full, in silence. When he finished, he looked up at her. His expression was, as always, controlled. But she had been working with him long enough to read the things his expressions didn't say. "You know this connects to your husband," he said. "My ex-husband," she corrected. "Does that change anything for you?" Suzie looked at him steadily. "It changes what I feel," she said. "It doesn't change what's right." Adrian regarded her for a long moment. Then something rare happened. He smiled. Not the faint, calculated curve of the lips that served as his professional equivalent of approval. A real smile, brief and unguarded. The smile of someone who had been waiting for a specific answer for a long time and had just received it. "That," he said, "is exactly what I needed to know." What she had not known, what no one outside of a very small circle knew, was that Adrian Black had been building a case, not just an acquisition, a case. The company was a target, But it was also a key piece in a much larger puzzle that Adrian had been assembling quietly for 3 years. A network of financial misconduct that had cost a great many people a great deal. Not just money, but livelihoods, security, futures. Adrian Black had his own reasons for caring about that. Reasons he had kept entirely private until this moment. He had lost someone too. Not to betrayal of the romantic variety, but to the same fundamental human failure. The willingness of people to choose their own advantage over basic honesty, regardless of who it destroyed. He had been working toward accountability for 3 years, and Suzie, without knowing it, had just handed him the last piece of the map. She had not been hired in spite of her devastation. She had been recognized because of what her devastation had produced. A woman with absolutely nothing to protect except her integrity, and an acute, hard-won ability to detect dishonesty from 1,000 paces. Adrian had seen that in her the night she lay in a hospital bed, and he had visited not out of guilt, but out of genuine recognition. He had looked at her and seen someone who had already been broken down to her foundations, and what was left at the foundation was real, worth building on. Suzie sat with this understanding for a very long time, not with anger. She had burned through anger months ago. Not with gratitude either. Gratitude felt too passive for what she felt. What she felt, sitting in that glass office on the 43rd floor with the city spread below her like a map of everything that was now possible, was something that did not have a simple name. It was the particular feeling of a story turning, of looking back at a path you've walked and understanding, for the first time, the full shape of it. Every step that had seemed like destruction had been, in a way she could not have seen from inside it, construction. The end of her marriage had felt like the end of her. It was not. It was the end of a version of her that was too small for what she actually was. The legal consequences of what Suzie uncovered moved with the quiet, inevitable momentum of things that have been building for a long time. Nathan's business partner was the first to receive formal notification. Then the holding companies. Then Nathan himself, who learned, on a Thursday morning, that the financial architecture he had constructed over 4 years was being dismantled piece by a team of lawyers and regulators who had been provided an exceptionally well-organized and complete brief by someone with an intimate understanding of exactly where to look. He knew immediately who had found it. There was no one else it could have been. He called. She did not answer. He called again. She did not answer. He sent messages, the kind that began with anger and shifted, progressively, towards something that might have been an approximation of remorse. Suzie read them the way you read something in a language you used to speak fluently but have chosen to stop using. She understood every word. She felt nothing she needed to act on. She forwarded them to her lawyer, Lila, who had always had an instinct for self-preservation that she dressed in the costume of warmth and friendship, quietly removed herself from the situation. She did not call Suzie. She did not apologize. She simply receded, the way people with no real substance recede when the performance is no longer serving them, and moved on to the next chapter of her own story. Suzie found that she had less feeling about this than she expected. The grief she had felt for the loss of Lila's friendship was already fully processed, fully mourned, fully laid to rest. There was nothing new to feel. You cannot lose something you have already grieved. What Suzie felt instead, on the morning that Nathan's legal troubles became public knowledge, was not satisfaction. That is the response people expect from stories like this. The hot, immediate satisfaction of watching the villain receive his consequences. But that is a simpler feeling than the truth, and Suzie Calloway had stopped living in simple feelings. What she felt was something quieter and more durable. It was the feeling of having been completely honest about something difficult, and having that honesty produce something real. It was the feeling of integrity made visible, of knowing without question or ambiguity exactly who she was. 12 months after she signed her name in a hospital room while her hand trembled, Suzie Calloway was named Director of Strategic Development at Black Industries. It was not a title that was given to her. It was a title she had arrived at through 12 consecutive months of the hardest and most purposeful work she had ever done. Adrian announced it in a meeting of 30 people, said 12 words. There is no one more equipped for this responsibility than Suzie Calloway, and sat back down. Suzie stood up and gave a brief, clear, focused address about the direction she intended to take the department, and when she sat back down, the room felt different. She felt different. Not larger, Exactly. More accurate. Like something that had been out of focus for a very long time had finally resolved into clarity. She was not, it should be said, in love with Adrian Black. That is the resolution many people reach for at this point in a story like this. The romantic arc, the inevitable merger of the woman who was saved and the man who saved her. But the truth was more interesting and more honest than that. What existed between Suzie and Adrian was something that had no clean romantic name. A deep professional respect, a mutual recognition, a partnership built on honesty and shared purpose. That was more sustaining than most romantic relationships Suzie had ever witnessed. There were moments of feeling between them. She would have been lying to say otherwise. Moments in which the air changed quality and something went, unspoken that was not nothing. But they were both, by nature and by choice, people who understood the value of what was working and the danger of what was unnecessary. They built on what was real. They left the rest alone. Her mother asked her, on a Sunday call that lasted almost 2 hours, whether she was happy. It was asked with the particular maternal anxiety of someone who had watched their child suffer and was still not entirely convinced the danger had passed. Suzie thought about the question carefully before answering, which was itself an answer of a kind. The old Suzie would have answered, instantly, reassuringly, adjusting the truth to the comfort of the listener. The new Suzie thought about it. "I'm not sure happy is the right word," she said finally. "I feel real. I feel like I know who I am. I feel like nothing can be taken from me without my permission anymore." She paused. That might be better than happy. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think it might be. Here is the thing about this story that matters most. It is not a story about revenge. It is not a story about romantic love. It is not even really a story about betrayal, though betrayal is where it begins. It is a story about identity, about what you discover you actually are when everything you thought you were has been stripped away, about the terrifying and ultimately liberating experience of standing in the rubble of a life you built and realizing, with complete clarity, that the rubble was never the point. You were always the point. The life around you was just the first draft. Suzie Calloway lost her marriage. She lost her best friend. She nearly lost her life. She lost the version of herself that was defined entirely by her relationships to other people, the devoted wife, the loyal friend, the woman whose value was calculated in how much she gave and how little she asked for in return. All of that, gone, all of it necessary, not because pain is a prerequisite for growth. It isn't. And anyone who tells you otherwise is dressing cruelty in the language of wisdom. But because Suzie was living a life that was not actually hers, she was living a life built around what other people needed her to be. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the only thing powerful enough to free you from a cage you've stopped seeing as a cage is to lose it entirely. The people who betray us are not our teachers. That is too generous a title for what they do. But the betrayal itself, the specific, particular experience of discovering that the ground you were standing on was never solid. That can be a teacher if you survive it and if you choose to learn from it rather than to be defined by it. Suzie chose to learn, not immediately, not without pain, not without walking into traffic on a dark road and nearly not coming back, but eventually, stubbornly, on her own terms. She chose to learn. And what she learned is what all of us know somewhere deep in ourselves, but rarely find occasion to practice. That we are most powerful, not when we are most loved, but when we are most honest. When we see clearly ourselves, other people, the situations we are in, and we respond to what we actually see rather than to what we wish we were seeing. That clarity is not comfortable. It is not warm or candid or easy to live inside, But it is solid. It holds weight. It does not collapse when someone removes their support from it. Suzie Calloway became, in the 12 months that followed the worst night of her life, someone she would have found impossible to imagine when she was standing outside a window on Birchwood Lane. Not harder. Not closed off. Not armored in the brittle, fearful way of someone who has been hurt and decided never to be hurt again. But clear and honest and genuinely, substantively, unmistakably powerful in the way that only real clarity produces. The kind of powerful that has nothing to prove to Nathan Calloway, nothing to prove to Lila, nothing to prove to anyone, because it is not a performance, it is not a response. It is simply, finally, exactly who she is. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from losing everything, not the freedom of having nothing to hold on to. That is just emptiness dressed in a philosophical costume. But the freedom of discovering, in the absence of everything you thought defined you, what actually remains, what cannot be taken, what was always there, waiting, underneath the good wife and the loyal friend and the woman who trusted people all the way to her own destruction. That is the freedom Suzie found. That is the freedom she chose. On a night when choosing was the hardest thing she had ever done. And that is what this story is actually about. Not the woman who was betrayed, but the woman who was revealed. Not the ending of one life, but the true, real, terrifying, magnificent beginning of another. If you are listening to this and you recognize something in Suzie's story, if you know what it feels like to love someone who was not worth your love, or to trust someone who was not worthy of your trust, or to stand in the wreckage of something you built and wonder what comes next, then this is what I want you to hear. You are not the wreckage. You were never the wreckage. You are what survives it. And what survives it is, without exception, stronger than anything that came before. The story isn't over for you either. It is, if you choose it, just beginning. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Comment where you're watching from, and also your local time. I would really love to meet my community members. See you soon in our next story.